Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Khalil. Our show was brought to you by Whoop. Start tracking your strain, recovery, and sleep scores today. To get your hands on a free strap and an extra month's membership, make sure to click the link in our description. On today's episode, I have Brian Friend and Chase Ingram here because we are talking about if the current judging standards are up to par. Now, CrossFit, they recently sent out their Hopper email. Inside it, an article titled The Judge's Job. When talking about the game's judges specifically, looking at primarily divisions other than individual, it reads that at bare minimum, you must be a CrossFit Level 1 certificate holder and have taken the most recent judges courses. Our volunteers also must have previous judging experience at other live competitions. So I'm curious, Chase, we'll start with you. Does that mean that off-season competitions are essentially the test run for judges?
I think 100% it is. Who better to talk to that than Patrick himself, right? Like that's where he got his judging, teeth gnawed into. But yes, that's what they should be for. And I think a lot of off-season competitions should aim for that. But you got to think like off-season competitions, there's so much going on that they have to work with and volunteers that it's almost like a beggars can't be choosers. Like they'll get to a certain point where they'll take anybody to facilitate a competition. I mean, let's be real. No event will take place without volunteers and judges. None. You can't just run it on merit and honor. It's not going to happen, right? And so I think it's really important these off-season competitions for those that want to judge at semifinals, CrossFit Games, whatever. They need to take the extra step to get to these competitions and get experience going into the game season.
Brian, what are your thoughts on that? Especially because then what does that mean for these off-season competitions when there are payouts at the end of them?
I think that the filtering process for judging in the sport is a kind of a good replica or mirror of what it can also be like for athletes in the sport. And that is that there's almost these tiers. And so I just think about a little in-house competition that I run at my gym. And some people want to be involved in that event, but they don't want to compete in the event. So they have opportunities to volunteer and they can judge at that competition. And yes, it's amongst their peers, or they can move equipment. And sometimes what happens in these small, little local competitions is someone does it and they realize that they really like it. And if you really like judging in your affiliate, or you really like moving equipment around in your affiliate, guess what? Like, there are opportunities for you to take a weekend away and go travel and volunteer to do that at a slightly bigger competition. And then that can move into a semifinal competition. And then you might make some connections and relationships there with allow you to have opportunities and credentials that eventually you're, judging at the CrossFit Games. Like that is a real path that anyone could take if that's something they're passionate about. When it comes to the second part of your question, at those higher level competitions, there generally is also a feedback process. And as the weekend narrows down, most of the time, they're also evaluating the judges and then trying to select the judges who have performed the best that weekend based on the head judges or the review of the judges committee there for the final events when the spotlight's the biggest. That doesn't happen all the time, but that is a process that happens at a lot of these events.
So when we're looking at some of the bigger off-season events like Madrid, Rogue, Dubai, Wadapalooza, should those be these beginner judges who are volunteering for the first time as well? Or should there be a different standard for them?
I think this in part is, like some of these events are CrossFit licensed events. And I know that there's a lot of conversation about what does that necessarily mean and what is CrossFit's level of involvement in those events. And I think that this is just an opportunity for growth and for maybe CrossFit to build that out a little bit, that those CrossFit licensed events can potentially have different expectations depending on certain things. And maybe it's the prize purse. I know that there's a lot of conversation about what happened in Madrid because of how it affected the payouts at the end of the weekend. And maybe CrossFit looks at it and says, if you have a minimum prize purse of this, then there's a certain level of standards that we'll expect you to hold, at least for the divisions that are paying out that money. And while Madrid's a great example of this because they had thousands of athletes and dozens of divisions, you could have plenty of opportunity for people to cut their teeth, like Chase says, in some of those other divisions. But the people that are judging the last heats of the individuals in the final events, they should probably have some credentials to back up their right to be on the floor with those athletes.
I think Brian's 100%. And, when you look at the more novice divisions in any type of off-season competition, that's where the first timers need to go. You need to be in the scaled division where it's more community focused anyways. It's not hardcore. I mean, all standards should always be upheld, but like Brian, in any local event that I've put on myself is we do the same thing, right? We'll put the people that are a little bit more novice in the first couple of heats where there's not much on the line. But as we get deeper into the weekend, we start to vet who the more comfortable, the very articulate, the scene correcting athletes, and we put those in the finals, especially for the finals events. The same thing should be happening in all these competitions. Not saying it's like you should be doing this, but they should want to do that. A huge fear of mine of any event I've ever put on, or if anybody walks into my class that I'm coaching, that someone from the outside will be judging what's happening based off what's happening on the floor or what's happening with the gym, whether you're not getting enough coaching from the person in charge or there's not being enough standards being held by the judges on the floor. So I think it's more not necessarily like scolding any event on their judging standards, but they should all want to uphold that. And there is a way to do that. And I think anybody should sit back and say, okay, if we're going to put $30,000 on the line, like Brian was talking about with Madrid, we should have a standard upheld of who will be judging these categories. But like I said, to start the conversation off is sometimes there's a situation where you are just at the mercy of who you have available to you because it's still a volunteer deal during the off season.
And I mean, you both bring up great points, and it seems like right off the bat, you guys have potentially a solution. So who do you think should be deciding this, especially when we're thinking about like CrossFit sanctioned events? Should it be them or should it be the event organizer? Who's the one that should come up with these rules and potentially having like, okay, people who have had real CrossFit judging experience are judging those final heats with money on the line?
What do you think?
Who lays down the hammer?
I look at it a lot like if you're a CrossFit licensed event, there's a much different than being a CrossFit sanctioned as far as a semifinal event. A CrossFit licensed event is not dissimilar from saying being a licensed CrossFit affiliate, where you have paid to use the brand name. So you can use that in all of your marketing tools. There are local throwdowns in Texas that are licensed events that are nowhere near the level of the Rogue Invitational, but they're literally the same thing. They're just a CrossFit licensed event. In fact, I don't even know if Rogue is an actual licensed event like other ones around the world. And so it really comes down to resources availability as far as the size, but I still think the quality should always be the same. And that still falls on the director of the competition, because it's not CrossFit's job to come in there and dictate what they do. It's not CrossFit's job to come in there and say, this is what you need to do. Just like it's not CrossFit's job to do that in the affiliate. We just hope that everybody would have enough pride and standards to uphold and take care of themselves when it comes to running a competition, just like running an affiliate.
And if to Chase's point, if you're not familiar, or if you haven't seen that Hopper article yet, if you can get a hold of it, if you scroll to the bottom, they actually have a list of upcoming licensed events, and it's events like Game Day North 2022, Tuscany Games, Costa Brava Fitness Challenge. You haven't heard of these things, but that's what I think needs to be explored is, what does it mean to be a CrossFit licensed event? And if you're doing that, what's CrossFit communicating to in terms of the expectations? That's why I just think a little bit of a conversation and maybe building out of that process so that we can say, Costa Brava, this is what we expect from you. But Rogue, if you want to be a licensed event, we know that you have this much money on the line and there's a lot more at stake. So our expectations are a little bit more robust.
So even when we're talking about judging and who should be creating these rules, we look at a competition like Madrid, and there was no daily athlete briefing. The way that athletes were briefed on the standards was 10 to 15 minutes before their heat went out on the floor. What are your thoughts on that? Should there be a universal, hey, there needs to be an athlete briefing for everybody at the start of each day of competition, even for these off-season competitions?
I mean, my personal opinion is yes, there should be some at least best practices. And I liken this back to the affiliate model, is that there is a playbook that CrossFit can give affiliates of, hey, here are best practices, tools, not rules. We've heard that before. In a license event, I think there should be, when we talk about communication, CrossFit should be like, hey, here's the basics of running a competition. Here's the website, the setup, the leaderboard. Give them that. They're paying to use this, right? They are paying a fee to say CrossFit. Why not give them something a little bit more than just a graphic that they can put on their website that says CrossFit on it, or a CrossFit license event? Give them maybe a playbook. They can use it or not, but at least you've done your job and say, here's the best practices. Here's what's worked. There should be a daily briefing. I mean, clearly there should be a daily briefing of the events, if not the night before. I mean, I've done that, and my event had 50 to 75 people in it that nobody knew about, right? I'm sure Brian does the same thing because we've been to all of these events. We know what works. And so, yes, there should be at least maybe not say, I'm sorry, I don't mean should be. It'd be nice to say, hey, here's best practices in a little folder. Thank you for being a licensed event. Do with what you will, because at least they can say we did our part instead of forcing people to do certain things.
Actually, recently I've been trying to move away from the athlete briefing, but the way that I do that is by having very clear communication much earlier than that. And I think this is another area that there's an opportunity for improvement from a consistency perspective, which is if CrossFit, in the same way that they had a rule book, if they just made maybe a rule book of movement standards for common movements in CrossFit, and they update it every January, and they just had those little new tabs anytime something changed, then everyone who's running a competition that year from January 1st until December 31st could reference back to that. If they're choosing to use an implement or a movement that's not in that rule book, and then they're on their own for their competition, or if they're CrossFit licensed event, then they work with CrossFit to see about either adding that to the rule book next year, or maybe ask them, we want to do this thing. It's a little different than what the movement you have listed there is. Can you work with us to come up with a good set of movement standards? So again, there's a conversation being had. When I announce a workout, I also send an email that has the workout flow written out step by step. And for every movement, the standards listed out step by step to the athletes and the judges ahead of time. And I tell them, please, if there's something that's unclear, let me know, because now I have X number of dozen eyeballs on it 2-3 weeks ahead of time, a month ahead of time, so that if I've missed something or if something's unclear, we have a chance to get it correct then. If I don't tell them anything until the morning of or 15 minutes before the event, if I've overlooked something or my team has overlooked something, there's not a lot of opportunity to address that in the moment.
So then this would require competitions to maybe not release the entire workout ahead of time, but at least the movements.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. If there's a common movement rule book, then any coach for any athlete from a casual to elite in the sport could say, okay, any competition we go to that's doing chest to bars this year, this is the expectation. Burpees, here's the standard. And then it's understood. So no one's surprised. No one shows up to competition. I wonder which standard of the burpee they're going to use at this one. Say, why are there so many standards of burpees? Let's just have one. If we think there's a better one, change it for the year. Let's see how it plays out. Evaluate at the end of the year if you want to change it again or not.
I totally agree.
Okay.
I've been waving that flag for a couple years now. Is we have a rule book of the competition season. I think this is where I will say there should be a standards book of every movement used in CrossFit competition. I'm not saying this is the standards you need to be putting inside your gym for your Joe Schmo and Jane Doe that walk through the door. That's not the point, right? We're talking about competition. We're talking about sport. There should be rules. As Brian said, I should be able to walk into the 2023 CrossFit game season knowing exactly what a bar facing burpee is and what box I'm going to use for handstand push-ups this year. That should never change. It's already out there. The IF3 already does this and has this. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. In fact, I know the IF3 would like to give this to the CrossFit Games department so that they can do it's all the same. It's all the same. It's just competition. And so having that would be huge. And then athletes get to practice the standard. They know what it is instead of making things up on the fly, wondering what it's going to be this year.
And to the larger picture at hand here. And then the judges also know. And so if you know that you're going to be judging a local competition, a semi-major competition, a semifinal competition, or at the games, or any or all, you can, at your box, say, hey, they got a new burpee standard. Would you mind coming in and doing some of these burpees? We're going to film it. I want to practice and make sure that I get that right. And I think that the judges that are volunteering to go to these things, and a lot of them volunteer to go to a lot of them, would probably take the time to do that, because I know from talking to them, a lot of them over and over again, they want to do a good job out there, just like the athletes want to do well. And this is something that could be done up front to set up both teams of people, judges and athletes, for more success on the floor, less scrutiny from the fans, and more opportunity to celebrate the fitness that's actually happening.
Chase, what's your bottom line? Are current judging standards up to par?
No, but I mean that in terms of, even if they were great, CrossFit would say the same thing. It's never there. We're never there ever. And we can always improve upon that. So to say that they are up to par and just good to go, I think would discredit the efforts that are coming through CrossFit HQ for as far as the game season is concerned. So I say no in sense of, yeah, we should always be getting better, but I do think there is clear room for improvement in many ways, but in also very simple ways as well. So yes, there is room for improvement.
Brian, what's your bottom line?
I agree. The judging standard and line should always be pushed forward, and it's an excellence that wants to be upheld. That's what those people and those teams are about. I think there are procedural things that could be done ahead of time that would give us a better chance to meet those high expectations.
Brian and Chase, thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next time.